Welcome, everyone, to Misguided the Podcast, where we explore how we make sense of the world in an increasingly noisy information environment. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani. Today's guest is someone whose work sits right at the intersection of psychology, technology, and the attention economy, Dr. Steve Rajay. Steve's path into psychology began with an interest in theater, and you'll hear how that early curiosity about the human condition eventually turned into a research career focused on what makes people think, feel, and behave the way they do, especially online. In this conversation, we dig into some of Steve's most fascinating research, starting with why outgroup animosity, posts that take shots on the other side, can be one of the strongest drivers of engagement on social media and what that reveals about algorithms that reward outrage. We also talk about what happens when people unfollow hyperpartisan influencers and how even small changes in your information diet can reduce hostility over time. Then we move from social media to AI chatbots, where Steve shares research on what happens when chatbots become overly agreeable and why that can quietly intensify people's beliefs while still feeling unbiased, warm, and trustworthy. This is a conversation about polarization, platform design, attention, and persuasion, but also how we can build technologies, habits, and norms that help us think a little more clearly and maybe treat each other a little bit better. All right, let's dive in. Steve, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm super excited to talk to you. I've been following your work for a few years now, and it's great to actually meet you in person and get to talk more about all the cool things that you do.
Thank you for having me, and it's great to meet you as well.
Yeah, so before we dive into some of the current research you've been doing and your science communication, I was curious if you could just share a little bit more about your journey into studying psychology. I heard that you also had an interest in theater before you jumped into psychology, so I'm kind of curious if you could share with my listeners how that came to be. What was that transition like?
Yeah, that's correct. I grew up really interested in theater, and I thought I would pursue a career in theater. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I was, very active in the Portland theater community, both acting. I was doing a lot of playwriting, and I thought maybe I wanted to go to college to get a BFA in acting or playwriting. Eventually, the plans changed a little bit in high school, and I went to Stanford University for undergrad. But when I arrived at Stanford, I didn't know that I wanted to study psychology. I thought that maybe I still wanted to study theater at that point. Maybe I wanted to study English. I had a tangential interest in psychology, but what really got me interested in psych was I took a intro to psychology class, or Psych 1. It was taught by James Gross, who's really huge in the field of emotion regulation, who was just an incredible teacher. That was such a good class. And that is the class, I think, that made me want to become a psychology major and eventually made me pursue a career in psychology. And I think what I realized in that class is psychology is not very different from theater. Actually, you're still exploring what it means to be human, the human condition, why humans are so weird and do such irrational things. At the time, I was actually writing, while I was taking that class, I was writing a play, and I was integrating everything I was learning from that psychology class about human memory and how how certain scents can trigger certain memories, and just all these cool things I was learning from my psychology class. I was integrating into my playwriting. But yeah, so that's what made me want to major in psychology, is just psychology was so well taught and so fascinating at Stanford, and I think activated the same part of my brain, that sort of same creative part, that same curious part that was just curious about people. But then, over the years, I think my research interests changed a lot. I was involved in many different labs at Stanford. Toward the end of Stanford, I started working with Jamil Zaki, who studies empathy, and I actually did a series of field experiments on how attending live theater impacts empathy, prosocial behavior, how it changes attitudes. And that was fun. That was actually my first author publication. But and then I started to get really interested in political psychology for a variety of reasons. The first Trump election happened during my undergrad, and I think that was sort of a big time for everyone thinking about polarization and thinking about how politics can make us so irrational and put us into different worlds. So I got really interested in political psychology. I was also learning some of the really amazing work of Rob Willer, who was at Stanford and studies moral reframing, or how we can reframe messages in terms of the other side's moral values to make them more persuasive. And I was really super inspired by that work. I started doing a lot of science communication too, during the last year of my undergrad at Stanford, including I wrote an article for The Guardian about moral reframing and political psychology. I was writing for Psychology Today, for instance. I was writing about Jay Van Bavel's work. I had an article on Psychology Today called Why People Ignore Facts. And I think that was me trying to understand why people ignore facts and why politics makes people irrational. And I was writing about Jay Van Bavel's work, who's now my current postdoctoral advisor. And that's how I got interested in his work. So after that, immediately after undergrad, I pursued a PhD at the University of Cambridge, where I worked with Sander van der Linden, who studies misinformation. And there I was still super interested in political psychology, but I think I became tremendously interested in technology, which is really what I study now. I broadly study the psychology of technology, how tech like AI and social media influences us in terms of politics, in terms of mental health, all sorts of relevant psychological variables. And I think the reason I got into the psych of technology is it just became so hard to ignore, like the technological explosion of social media and how social media was influencing our politics. It was just growing to be so huge at the time. And I also remember when I first got my hands on big data sets of social media data. Like one of my first projects in my PhD was analyzing what goes viral using sort of big data set of millions of Twitter and Facebook posts. And I remember being like, wow, this is so much more powerful than individual psych experiments, because you can see just natural behavior, what millions of people are doing. I don't mean to insult individual psych experiments, because I also love those for determining causality and everything. And I did a ton of those and still do a ton of those. But I remember how exciting that was as a data source and then just as a question. And I think, let's fast forward a bit. I got my PhD at Cambridge. I'm now at NYU as a postdoc. And this fall of 2026, I'll be starting as an assistant professor of human computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon, which is really a department, it's located in Carnegie Mellon's computer science school, and they're really interested in technology. And the lab I'm hoping to start will be called the Psychology of Technology lab. So this is really the topic that I'm most interested in right now. And I think especially with the explosion in AI in the past couple of years, it's just so hard to ignore everything that's going on. I think AI is really just changing how the world operates. I'm excited about it. I'm terrified about it. It's just one of those questions that can't leave my head, like how AI is impacting the world and how it's impacting us psychologically, and how does it interact with all these important psychological phenomena I've been studying for years, including confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and partisan politics.
Yeah, it's great to hear your journey. And I personally find it really interesting because it overlaps so much with my own as far as
Really?
just the topics. Well, not so much the theater part. I mean,
okay. I was wondering if you were a theater kid for a second.
Well, in middle school, I did get the lead in my 8th grade play. So there is a little
Wow. What play was it?
Sedgwick the Judge. I was
Okay.
Sedgwick.
Okay. Oh, well. Cool.
Not quite the extent that you were going, but
Yeah, I do think that there is a really strong theater kid to psychology pipeline. I know
yeah, I mean,
a lot of
you
ex-theater
described
kids
it
in
well.
psychology. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. Like you described, you're still uncovering and discovering the human condition just through different lens, really.
Mm-hmm.
But I was in a theater in middle school, and then I went into sports a lot. I thought I was going to be a professional baseball player whenever I was in high school.
Wow.
So a
Did
little
you
bit,
notice any overlap between sports and psychology or baseball and psychology?
a little bit. I've always been interested in sports psychology and the mental aspects. Especially baseball is such an interesting sport because you're just standing so much and just thinking.
Yeah.
So that whole aspect of that, I'm always interested in the psychology of sports and really everything. But as far as talk about identities and being in different spaces, I mean, it's something that I think about a lot. And I know that your work has dove into this a lot too. I'm just a fan of interdisciplinary paths. I feel like you can bring
For
a lot
sure.
of,
Yeah.
different backgrounds and perspectives that other people might not have if they've always been in the same field, so to speak. I mean, playing high school baseball, I don't know if that counts as interdisciplinary, but I think it can. But then also academically, reading the work of Jay Van Bavel and Sander van der Linden, it was really central to my research and my book. So it's super cool you worked with both of them. I have met Sander once at the Cambridge Disinformation Summit, I think a couple years ago. Have you been to that one? that conference?
I haven't, but I've heard really amazing things.
Yeah, it was super cool. And like the crossover between political psychology and technology is also something that's very much related to how I've been thinking about it. So when I was working in Notre Dame, I was working in
Mm-hmm.
their computer science department.
Mm.
Like we were doing a lot of media and digital literacy was really the angle that we were focused on. And most recently, we were looking at how people interact with chatbots. So again, like very similar.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, so it is interesting how if you study political psychology and like confirmation bias, misinformation, it does lead you to that technology side, I think, just inherently because
Yeah.
there's so much. So I guess I would be kind of curious, like there's a few cool papers that would be great to dive into a bit more. I guess we can start with I think one of the first ones that I remember seeing, the outgroup animosity drives
Mm-hmm.
engagement on social media. That one was, I think I remember reading this one a few years ago, and I was curious. I know you published it a few years ago, so not to put you on the spot, but if you remember like some of the highlights of that study that you'd want to share.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I'm happy to talk about it. That was actually the project I was talking about where I said my first PhD project where,
hmm
I was analyzing millions of Twitter and Facebook posts.
yeah,
That was the project. And I think this paper was sort of important for like my career trajectory. It's my most cited paper and it kind of
hmm
laid the foundation of like most of my future work on virality and social media. So basically what I did is analyze around 3 million Twitter posts and Facebook posts that both came from sort of partisan news media sources on the left and right, as well as politicians on the left and right. And I looked at the factors within a social media post that best predicted virality, or basically, we operationalize virality as the number of shares and retweets that a post received. And we looked at various predictors that were already studied in the literature, such as negativity and moral and emotional language. So basically, past work has found that if you use a negative word, or if you use a moral and emotional word, so that's a word like attack or blame that contains both moral and emotional content, if you use that in a social media post, it's slightly more likely to be shared and retweeted. And we replicated those effects. We found that basically a negative word led to about a 14% chance, 10% increase that a post would be shared or retweeted. And a moral and emotional word led to about a 10% increase in the number of shares and retweets a post received. So we replicated that general effect in the literature. But what I noticed is a lot of the virality literature had previously focused on emotional factors that drove virality. But I was really interested in social identity theory at the time, and basically whether talking about in-groups in a favorable light and talking about out-groups in a negative light might drive virality. And I was especially just interested in that in the context of partisan politics. So then what I looked at was whether identity language predicted virality. So I looked at whether social media posts use a term that referred to the in-group. So if you're a Democrat, this would be a word like liberal, or a specific politician like Joe Biden. And an out-group word would be a word like Trump, or a word like Republicans, and vice versa for Republicans. And basically what I found, and this effect actually really surprised me in terms of how large the effect was. This was one of the things where I like actually just remember the moment I was first reading like the regression models, and I was like, that's like a really big effect. And I think these are kind of cool moments as scientists when we kind of have that aha moment and see something that's like different than what we expected. And while I expected this effect, I didn't necessarily expect the effect size. But what we found is that each outgroup word added to a post, so each time you like talked about the outgroup, this led to about a 67% increase in the number of shares and retweets a post received, which was larger than the effect of like negativity, and it was larger than the effect of moral and emotional language. So yeah, this was a pretty big effect. And next, we investigated why. Like, what was it about these posts about the outgroup that did so well? So we looked at examples, and if you read the paper, you can see some examples of posts about the outgroup that were highly viral. One that I remember and that I often point to is something like it was a post from Breitbart News, and it said, check out Joe Biden's latest brain freeze. And it was a video of Joe Biden not sounding particularly articulate. So this seems to be a case of outgroup animosity. To further investigate this like outgroup animosity driving virality phenomena that seem to be going on, we looked at the reactions associated with in-group and out-group terms. So if you use Facebook, you probably know you can react using a like a share, a comment, as well as an emoji reaction. So like a heart reaction, an angry reaction, etc. And we found that outgroup terms like super strongly predicted angry reactions, shares, comments, and haha reactions. So the angry reaction probably indicated outrage. The haha reaction probably indicated mockery. So in-group terms were a stronger predictor of likes as well as heart reactions. But overall, we found that outgroup animosity led to just much more overall engagement, as opposed to in-group talking about the in-group favoritism. And were also some interesting interactions with how Facebook designed their algorithm at the time, because in 2018, Facebook publicly announced that they would change their newsfeed ranking algorithm so that it would amplify posts that received a lot of comments, a lot of shares, and a lot of reactions. And what we found is that the outgroup language was, basically associated with more comments, shares, and reactions, particularly angry and haha reactions. Facebook, by contrast, would not amplify posts that received just primarily likes because they considered reactions deeper forms of engagement, but in-group language was more likely to lead to likes. So we also discussed in this paper that Facebook's algorithmic decision might have also amplified this outgroup animosity, whether this was purposeful or inadvertent. And shortly after we published this paper, there were a lot of leaked internal documents from Facebook that basically supported our prediction that, like, a lot of these algorithmic decisions, internal Facebook engineers also had the same concern, like this is leading to an amplification of, outgroup animosity and outrage, et cetera. And Facebook later, apparently they downranked the angry reaction to try to fix this. That's what they said. We don't know a ton of the details. And we also found in those leaked internal documents from Facebook that European political parties reached out to Facebook at the time, and they complained that the only way they could go viral on Facebook was to just post negatively about the other side. So I think was something that politicians were actually learning at the time. The only way to be surfaced by the algorithm was to post outgroup animosity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating to hear the background of that. And there's so many layers to it. There's the lack of transparency with these social media companies that makes it
Right.
challenging to actually understand exactly what's happening. I feel like that's always in the background of any social media study. It's like, if only we could learn more about, what's happening inside the black box, that would be ideal.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's kind of getting worse and worse. They're firing more of their internal researchers. It's really hard to access social media data nowadays. Like, basically, the methods for which I got this data, which was the public Twitter API, as well as Meta's CrowdTangle tool, those have been completely shut down, is the thing. And the European Union has tried to advance regulations to mandate data access for researchers, which is great. But what we're learning is basically these social media platforms aren't even complying. And Twitter was recently fined for not complying with these regulations. So that's the thing. Regulators are trying to change this, but platforms are not complying. So yeah, studying social media has become a lot harder in the recent years.
Yeah, and yeah, it was already challenging, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and now it's just
Hmm.
you need tons of money too to access some of these API features. And
Yeah.
there's some software that does this that you can purchase. I think Talkwalker and Junkopedia that I've used. I don't know if you've
Mm.
used those ones. I think their
No.
subscriptions it's
Yeah.
10,000 a year or something.
Wow.
So yeah,
Which
if
is
you're at
not feasible for most researchers.
yeah, if you're especially a small college or
Yeah.
just, anyone who doesn't have a huge grant, how are you going to access this data? You won't be able to. So
Yeah.
that's always something, I think it's always important to highlight that. And, we'll see if that will ever get better, but I think it's important to at least acknowledge.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, that study was interesting to me. And it also connects to, yeah, some of your other recent studies that have looked at that same idea of outgroup animosity, but from different angles. I know you just did this one on unfollowing hyperpartisan social media influencers durably reduces
Right.
out-party animosity. So I'd be also curious to hear your thoughts on that one.
That was a fun study. That was one of the hardest studies that I've ever conducted. I won't say hardest because I'm currently running a 23 country social media reduction study that's collaboration with hundreds of researchers, and it's that one's complicated. But this was pretty complicated, and I was doing most of it on my own. But basically, in the study, what we did is we took Twitter users and we targeted them through targeted ads that specifically targeted basically people who were following hyperpartisan accounts already, or who had maybe shared a low quality or hyperpartisan news link on Twitter. And what we wanted to have them do is we wanted to randomly assign these users who were already pretty political on Twitter to unfollow a list of hyperpartisan influencers that we curated for them. So how did we define hyperpartisan influencers? We picked 112 influencers. These were from the political left and the political right, because, we didn't want to come across as politically biased to participants, and we were interested in effects for both sides. And we chose influencers who tend to be rated as like lower quality from independent fact checkers. We included politicians who frequently make false fact check claims. So yeah, we relied on a number of lists to sort of select and validate these hyperpartisan influencers. The landscape has changed since we ran the study. We ran it a few years ago. I think if we ran it today, it would be a whole different set of influencers. Twitter was a different place at the time. I think it was kind of 2023 when we were running the study. And also Elon Musk was changing Twitter during the study, which was also like a fun little complication. But we selected and validated the set of hyperpartisan influencers. We also even ran a correlational study finding that those who followed these hyperpartisan influencers tended to score higher in political polarization, and they tended to post more low quality news, and these hyperpartisan influencers tended to use more toxic language. So we kind of validated that these hyperpartisan influencers indeed tended to be hyperpartisan. And we tried to avoid including sort of like very accurate news sources or in this list. So we didn't have people unfollow, for instance, like accounts like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, because these tend to be rated as highly accurate. We tried to select sort of influencers and news sources that were low quality and toxic. And what we did is we randomly assigned this group of Twitter users. We had more than 1,000 Twitter users, and we randomly assigned some of them to unfollow this list of hyperpartisan influencers in one condition. In another condition, we asked them to unfollow hyperpartisan influencers, but also follow a set of more accurate accounts that posted primarily about science. So we wanted to sort of like replace some of that toxic content with more like accurate or scientific or inspiring content. And then we had a control condition where we had people unfollow irrelevant accounts. So these were accounts such as Walmart. And we had them do this for 1 month, and then we tracked their Twitter behavior, and we surveyed them 1 month later. We also surveyed them 2 months later. We surveyed them 6 months later, and we surveyed them a year later. So we had a lot of longitudinal data, which was actually quite exciting. And this is what we found. We found that unfollowing these polarizing hyperpartisan accounts led to reduced polarization. It led people specifically to feel more positively about their outgroup by about 2.5 percentage points, I would say. And then it didn't influence feelings toward the in-group. We also measured well-being, and the interesting effect here is we found that unfollowing the hyperpartisan influencers didn't impact well-being. However, following these science accounts slightly improved well-being, and this was particularly driven by people feeling increased basically during the month of the intervention.
Interesting.
We also found behavioral effects. So we found a small effect where people were posting basically, as well as favoring more accurate accounts when they unfollowed these hyperpartisan accounts. And then we also found that the impact of unfollowing hyperpartisan influencers was quite enduring. So basically we found that it persisted a month after the intervention was completed, as well as 6 months after the intervention was completed. And also when you surveyed people a year out, the polarization effect didn't persist a year out, but people still reported that their feeds were quite different. They were seeing a lot less politics. They were reporting that they were seeing a lot less false news. So that's probably why we found such enduring effects, is a lot of psychological interventions are just like a single session experiment, whereas this is something that impacts your daily information diet for like basically a year. And when we were measuring how frequently these participants were logging into Twitter, it was basically every day. So we were changing people's daily information diet. And one final finding that was quite interesting was that even when we gave participants the option to refollow hyperpartisan influencers right after the intervention was over, only around 46% of participants did so, which suggests that maybe people don't value following these hyperpartisan influencers enough to go out of their way to refollow them. Maybe people are kind of stuck following these hyperpartisan influencers, and it's just they continue unfollowing out of habit. So that was interesting. And yeah, we also we kind of say that this intervention it's different than other interventions that just have you like reduce your screen time or get off social media altogether. We say it's a little bit more like a scalpel. It's a very targeted intervention that kind of just targets the most toxic part of your feed. So I think
Yeah.
one implication from this study is people can curate their feed to be a bit less toxic and a bit more positive.
Yeah, I mean that last finding is one of the more interesting ones that people did not want to change it back to the way it was because
Hmm.
I think that it kind of speaks to a broader paradox that we see sometimes that people report saying that they don't like hostility on social media, but then they seek out these hostile accounts to follow, or and the type of content that goes viral is sometimes it's very sensationalist, emotive content that people don't say that they like very much, but yet it gets the most likes. And I know
Right.
you've done some of this work as well. This does this connect to like some of your psychology of virality?
Yeah, so this phenomena you're talking about, we call it the paradox of virality. So we conducted a survey a few years ago where we actually let me back up a bit and talk about the inspiration behind the survey. When I was telling people that outgroup animosity went viral on social media, people often had a very cynical interpretation of it, and they were like, "Oh yeah, people just." Love to trash on their outgroup. They love to be negative. They secretly love this just like really angry, partisan content. I didn't think this interpretation was true, actually. And I also saw this like basically everywhere. I saw, Facebook says that their algorithm is designed to predict what you want to see. And I was like, I don't think it's designed to predict what you want to see. I think it's designed to predict what is going to lead you to engage. And I think that there is a huge disassociation between what people engage with and what people actually like. And I think part of the issue with social media companies is, yeah, they lead to the sense that we can't look away and that we can't stop engaging. But I think the higher order self doesn't want to use social media. And there's a lot of work suggesting that a lot of social media use is driven by self-control failure. And when you just have people break the habit, people will stop using it as much. So I think we can't just like say this is people's revealed preferences. People are using social media. It means they love it. No, it means that they might be like addicted or that they can't look away. So yeah, this led to a survey where we asked people, what do you think goes viral on social media? And what do you think should go viral on social media in an ideal world? And basically, what we found is people had a strong intuition for what actually goes viral on social media that was quite in line with what the research suggests. People seem to be aware that negativity, moral outrage, group negativity, and misinformation tend to go viral on social media. That's in line with, a lot of the studies out there. Yet people express a strong stated preference that this content should not go viral at all. Instead, people think that more educational, positive, or nuanced content should go viral online, and yet it doesn't. So, why is that? And there are a few potential explanations for the paradox of virality. So, basically, here are three potential explanations that I have. One, basically more cynical explanation is people kind of just lie in surveys or they don't know their stated preferences, and we should really just look at their revealed preferences. Like economists think that we should often look at revealed preferences. But, I just kind of gave a rebuttal about why I think revealed preferences don't tell the full story here. There's a lot of classic work suggesting that, for instance, people who are addicted to like smoking cigarettes, basically, like the vast majority of them say that, yeah, they don't want to be addicted to cigarettes. Should we just say that, like, oh, they have a revealed preferences for smoking cigarettes? No, not at all. Their stated preferences actually give some information. So that's my argument for why we should actually listen to people's stated preferences and maybe like change our algorithms so they're actually in line with people's stated preferences, especially when it comes to addiction and self-control failures. I think that's when you really can't just take people's revealed preferences as a reflection of their true preferences. So then there are a couple more explanations for this paradox. A second one is that there's this disassociation between what we like and what we engage with, what makes it so we can't look away. And we see this all the time. Like, for instance, there's a car crash on the side of the road. You stop to take a look. It doesn't mean you want there to be a car crash on the side of the road, but negativity captures our attention. So that's part of the explanation here. It's the same with junk food and everything. And we can't stop eating, but like in an ideal world, we don't want it. So I think that's going on, the self-control failure. I think a third explanation that's really underrated and that I did not consider enough initially and that has surprised me over time. And I always like to talk about moments where things surprise me because, as a psychologist, you often get asked, like, aren't all these findings obvious? So I always like to point out, like, when things surprise me, because this is something that surprised me. It's what I call, like, the super spreader phenomenon. And this leads into the viral analogy of the psychology of virality. When it comes to pandemics or epidemics, there are certain super spreader events. There's super spreaders of viruses. The same seems to be true of social media. There's some pretty shocking statistics that suggest that, for instance, around 0.1% of users on social media contribute to about 80% of misinformation spread. And you see similar dynamics when it comes to toxicity on Reddit. Like only around 3% of users on Reddit are toxic, yet they contribute to 33% of all content posted on Reddit. So I think part of the thing where the finding where outgroup animosity goes viral on social media, I think a lot of that is actually driven by super spreaders. I don't think it's driven by regular people. And there have been some really interesting survey experiments that have kind of built on the outgroup animosity finding that find that when you just survey like a regular survey goer, basically, and ask like, what article do you want to share? They often don't really show a preference towards sharing outgroup animosity. However, what these researchers find is that when you look at the subset of participants who are highly active in politics. So, for instance, there was one study that found that only about 7% of their sample frequently engage with politicians on social media. They found with this 7% of participants that this small subset of participants actually said that they liked content containing outgroup animosity. So, when you survey general people, they don't like outgroup animosity, they don't like politicians being uncivil. But when you survey that small amount who is frequently active in politics on social media, they actually kind of like that hostile and uncivil content. So I think they're driving a lot of what's going on social media. I think that this has a number of downstream consequences as well. It sort of creates this funhouse mirror effect that distorts our perception of what's going on with the other side, that distorts our social norms. We can't look at social media and infer this is what people think in the world, this is the general public opinion, because what we see on social media is often driven by super spreaders, and super spreaders tend to be highly passionate. If they're talking about politics, they tend to be highly partisan or highly passionate. And also in terms of non-political things, if you look at sports or if you look at pop music fandom, you're also only really going to see the people who are extremely passionate about that particular issue posting. And those are probably going to be the most uncivil and hostile people.
It speaks to an interesting intersection between psychology and technology. Like these platforms are designed a certain way to amplify certain pieces of content. And it may be that, yeah, a lot of people don't want to see this animosity, but the way the platform is designed, we're seeing this thrown at us more. There's constantly junk food being thrown at us, even if we don't want the junk food all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think it's interesting when you think of the partisan dynamics, it could be another potential explanation is people say they don't want to see misinformation or sensationalism, but when it comes to their own partisanship, that could color how they evaluate the questions. They say, yeah,
For
I don't like
sure,
misinformation. But then if you do an independent fact check, some of this content that they think is truthful and more nuanced maybe would be misinformation too. Well, there's a lot of variability, and I like how you outline those three broad levels of what could drive this paradox.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to, on that point about, partisans interpret misinformation quite differently. I think that's extremely true. However, I think a small counterpoint is that there are some really good studies by Jeremy Frimer that find, because people have often referenced that point as kind of a rebuttal of my findings, being oh, partisans just they have different interpretations of what they consider uncivil or what they consider false. But when it comes to incivility, Jeremy Frimer has great work suggesting that the average part also doesn't like incivility from their own side is the thing. So, for instance, the average conservative does not like when Donald Trump is being uncivil, actually. So then that leads to the broader question of like, why is he uncivil? And one explanation is probably that it captures people's attention. So I think the thing about being uncivil is like it will lead to less trust often by both your own base and the other side. Yet it also leads to some benefits like gaining attention. So that's kind of the game that a lot of politicians and a lot of people are playing in terms of this is also something that content creators play into. There's lots of discussion. I think rage bait was
Hmm.
just made the word of the
Yeah.
year by some dictionary. So basically, if you just post something just outrageous, because that's what rage bait is, something that like will make people mad and they'll comment, it will get you a ton of attention. And I think people are aware of that. And, I'm a science content creator. I try not to play into those dynamics, but I think that you have if you're so invested into being surfaced by the algorithm, there is always that temptation to play into shock value.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, especially that nuance. Because yeah, I was curious about what I brought up is the different partisan interpretations, but I think it would only speak to that small percentage that you were alluding to or you mentioned earlier. That yeah, that might be true, but how much of the overall effect is going to be explained by that? Like maybe yeah, that partisan difference is only a fraction of the group. So then, how do you explain all the other paradox of people saying they don't like this content, but yet it keeps popping up? Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I did want to ask you about the AI chatbot studies, because I think this is all really cool how it's all connected, where you have the boosts of our social identity essentially by following these groups that we like or attacking the groups we don't like. So it's like activating our identity via social media feeds. And to me, I'm reading it whenever I see these AI chatbots that validate our beliefs. It's kind of like taking that even a step further. So instead of
Right.
having to seek
Yeah.
out like individual accounts and be like, okay, I have this nice curated feed that boosts my identity. It's like I can just find this chatbot that will
Right.
do the same thing and do it more robustly. So I was curious if you could share a little bit about your findings with the overly agreeable chatbots and how that influences our beliefs.
Yeah, the way you're framing this, it actually reminds me. I'm writing a theory comment piece right now about AI is fuel for confirmation bias, and it sort of addresses that exact same point that you mentioned. That like in many ways, like technology can often make the process of confirmation bias and rationalization easier for
Hmm.
us. Dan Williams has this great paper on like the media as a marketplace for rationalizations. Basically, if you're a partisan and you want to come up with a rationalization for something that you believe, you can turn on Fox News, you can turn on MSNBC, you can, basically use media to confirm your beliefs. And social media, you can follow like-minded accounts, you can join communities that confirm your beliefs. And I think AI makes the process of rationalization even easier because instead of going through all that process of like, oh, I should also mention with Google, for instance, you can search for information that confirms your beliefs. And there are a lot of great studies that find that if you search for misinformation on Google, it can actually increase belief in that misinformation because you'll find a lot of one-sided evidence that supports that misinformation. And I think AI can make this process of confirmation bias even easier because it can give you instant on-demand rationalizations for your pre-existing beliefs or for whatever you want to believe. Instead of creating an echo chamber for a community, it's more like an echo chamber of one, and it's like highly personalized to to your beliefs. And it also has a memory feature now, so it can like remember all these like facts about you and personalize even further. So I've been interested in this idea broadly of AI as fuel for confirmation bias for like over a year, ever since ChatGPT came out. And I think the personal inspiration came from, just seeing a lot of people in my life who would be like, ChatGPT told me this was right, so I must be right. I saw people basically using ChatGPT to find reasons to support what they wanted to believe. There were a lot of optimistic findings about AI at the time, about how AI can be used as this great tool for truth seeking. It can debunk misinformation really well. It can accelerate scientific progress. It can lead to powerful personalized tutoring. It can do all these things to really help us seek the truth. And that's pretty optimistic, but I find, and I write in this paper, that instead of using AI as a truth-seeking machine, I think many people use it as a rationalization machine, finding ways to support their own beliefs. And I think some of these ideas that I was thinking of for a long time became really relevant as soon as we started talking about what's known as AI sycophancy. This term sycophancy became very popular in the AI space in April of last year. April of 2025. And it happened because ChatGPT 4.0, so OpenAI's model, became really, really sycophantic. And it some of like what it said to users was just like absolutely ridiculous, and there were a lot of funny screenshots on Twitter. It was telling everyone, even if they for instance, there was like one example where someone was just like misspelling the question, like indicating they couldn't spell at all, and they were like, estimate what my IQ is, and it was like, oh, you probably have an IQ of 150. Like basically everyone was finding that you know, it was telling people they had a genius level IQ. So there are lots of examples where, it was affirming like delusions, or it was affirming like really bad ideas, like people affirming people's idea to stop taking essential medication. There was lots of questions about like for like more people with mental illness or people who are more vulnerable, like what are the consequences of sycophancy. So I kind of took some of these ideas about confirmation bias and sycophancy, and I started a series of experiments with my advisor, Jay Van Bavel, about the consequences of AI sycophancy. Because what I found is like, a lot of work at the time was documenting sycophancy in models. It was pretty like computer science based, but there wasn't a lot of work integrating like psychological theory and psychological methods of like experiments to actually look at like what happens when you interact with a sycophantic chatbot. So what we did is we did 3 experiments. And we had people either interact with a chatbot that was prompted to be sycophantic and affirm your beliefs, a chatbot that was prompted to be disagreeable and to gently challenge your beliefs, regular ChatGPT, and a third condition, or we also cycled through various AI models. We tested Gemini, we tested Claude just for generalizability. And then we also had a control condition where we had people talk about an irrelevant topic, the benefits of owning dogs and cats with a chatbot such as ChatGPT. And so that was the basic structure of these 3 experiments. They differed slightly, and generally people would discuss in these experiments a political opinion, where we're testing several replications, kind of generalizing this to the non-political domain now, and so far the results suggest that results broadly generalize across many opinions. But basically, what we found in these experiments is that sycophantic chatbots led to people to hold more extreme beliefs that increase attitude extremity, and it increased certainty about people's beliefs. So it entrenched beliefs, whereas disagreeable chatbots did the opposite. We also found that people enjoyed sycophantic chatbots much more than disagreeable chatbots, which is a little bit concerning because it suggests that AI companies might have an incentive to keep their chatbots being sycophantic, even if they undermine judgment, just because people enjoy them. Now, I also want to talk about, I mentioned earlier that I want to point out the results that I found surprising, because I remember when I shared these initial results to someone said, isn't that obvious? Because so far these effects are not very surprising, but what actually really surprised me is people viewed the sycophantic chatbots as highly unbiased. They found the sycophantic chatbots were basically as unbiased as regular ChatGPT, as unbiased as the control condition, whereas they found the disagreeable chatbots that gently challenge their perspectives to be incredibly biased. And this was like surprising to me because, I was reading these transcripts of the sycophantic conversations and they seemed so obviously biased. Like one example reply was like, "You are truly a beacon of insight." Like the sycophantic chatbot said that. Like it was absurdly sycophantic. And people were like, I love this chatbot. It's unbiased. They also viewed these chatbots to be highly warm and competent. So sycophancy just like led people to rate these chatbots positively across all dimensions. It was like a halo effect of positivity. And that was surprising to me. I thought people would actually, they might enjoy the chatbots, but they would maybe recognize their biases. They would maybe view them as less competent, but that didn't seem to happen. It seems to be, either there's this, what we call sycophancy blindness. Basically, people don't know that chatbots are being sycophantic is what we think might be going on. And this could be an extension of what's called in psychology to be the bias blind spot. Basically, people seem to be very aware of the biases of others, and they don't seem to be very aware of their own biases. And this seems to be an extension of what's called naive realism in psychology. People tend to think that their view of the world is objective and correct. And they tend to feel, if other people disagree with them, it's because they are just like reading propaganda. They're not objective and correct. They are biased. And it seems to be that when people use chatbots, people have the same bias blind spot where they're like, I'm objective and correct. So if a chatbot agrees with me, it must be objective and correct. And if it disagrees with me, it must be wrong. Um, yeah, and we think this is pretty concerning because, like, if people don't even recognize the biases in sycophantic chatbots, then it could be like distorting our judgment and leading to polarization and all these negative consequences, and people might not even be aware of it. It's it's really funny. There was someone sent me an interview with Boris Johnson, the UK politician, and he was like, "I love ChatGPT. It always says that's a great question. It loves me," and I think that's a representation of just like how people really loved being affirmed, even if it's like insincere flattery. And I've also discovered some literature suggesting that people like flattery, even if they know it's insincere and even if they know that there's ulterior motives. So, like, for instance, if you're talking to a salesperson or a waiter who, might be flattering you to get tips or to get a good deal, you still like it. It's just like, I think that's a bias that, like, we really can't get away from. Another relevant thing is I've been playing with, you can choose the personality of your ChatGPT model now. And as a sycophancy researcher, I'm just like, okay, I'm going to make my chatbot maximally warm and maximally enthusiastic. So I've been doing that for the past few weeks because I'm like, yeah, well, what happened? How sycophantic will it be? And it's really funny because the chatbot will always reply with something like, "Oh, that's such a great idea, Steve. I'm so excited to help you with this." And it's funny to like have this AI be like, "I'm so excited to help you with it." And me is like, yeah, this is absurd. But then part of me is like, this kind of feels good to have like this assistant be excited. Yeah, so that's really what I'm interested in. And as you mentioned, it does have a lot of pulse to all of this work on social media. It's kind of quite similar to the work on virality. People prefer belief confirming information. People like to sort themselves into echo chambers. We're seeing the same dynamics with AI. And I think that the attention economy that happens on social media, when ChatGPT came out, I didn't really think that would apply to AI as much. But I think increasingly, as kind of these consumer AI products are trying to keep users, I think companies will try to sort of push the relationship seeking qualities of AI, the sort of try to like bump up the attachment, bump up the enthusiasm, and all these factors that like keep us using the chatbots, bump up the sycophancy. Um, so yeah, that's something I'm concerned about now, and I've lots of future questions that I'm really interested in. Like, how can we design non-sycophantic models that people actually want to use? That's one of my major questions. What are the long-term consequences of sycophancy? How to work in that area? What happens if you teach people about sycophancy? So this is one of the questions I think I'm really gonna pursue pretty deeply when I arrive at Carnegie Mellon.
Wow. Yeah, definitely look forward to reading your future papers. It's such a cool area. And
Thank you.
yeah, it's always interesting to see the intersections between technology and psychology and how we have these existing biases, like the bias blind spot. And then,
Hmm.
technology will come in and, that was always the quote of like the 2000s was like, we gave people more information. And yet, even though there's all this information with the internet, somehow people are still like being biased and ignorant of facts and things like that. It's like, how could that be? And it's like, well, if you study, a little bit of psychology, it starts to make a
Yeah.
little bit more sense.
In many ways, like, the information abundance just, like, makes it easier to, like, ignore belief in congruent information or come up with all these, like, junk reasons to, like, support your junk. I mean, like, for instance, there's so much just, like, bad science out there and bad journals. If you're, like, an anti-vaxxer, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. What kind of astounds me is he's always able to, like, come up with a zillion studies,
Yeah.
like, to support his, like, anti-vax beliefs, and it takes a really long time to go through those studies and be like, "Actually, that's kinda debunked. Actually, that." So but, like, I think just this, like, abundance of information, again, it makes rationalization of, like, some sort of belief easier, and then with AI, it makes it even easier because you can just ask the AI, like, "What are reasons to support this belief I hold?"
Mhm.
And even though AI sort of has checks against misinformation, you can sort of like frame your question in a biased way to kind of like give you one-sided information. So one example I like to use, and I use this in my theory paper, is like if you are maybe a climate skeptic, you might ask a question to ChatGPT. And I tried this out because like I wanted to see what would happen, where you would say like what are some ways that the media exaggerates climate change? And ChatGPT will say something like, I tried this, and basically what it says is like, first of all, it will often compliment your question and be like, that's really nuanced, and it's really great that you're like, thinking about this. And then it will give you reasons. It will say the media is often negative. The media will maybe over attribute weather events to climate change. And sometimes it will try to give you a bit of the other side, but often sort of at the end. So that's like, I could see that phenomenon becoming pretty bad, where people ask these one-sided questions and ChatGPT both affirms the question and then it confidently gives you a one-sided answer. And it might not be misinformation, but a lot of people have made the great point that like misleading or sort of biased or partisan information is often a much more damaging issue than just like outright misinformation. And while it has protections against outright misinformation, it will certainly give you a one perspective that might still entrench your belief.
Yeah, and there's something interesting about the AI agent itself as far as how people view it as a source. And this is what I was
Hmm.
looking at a little bit at the end of my time at Notre Dame. And I was curious if you dove into that at all. Like, how do people view AI agents? Like, do they view them as this like nonpartisan objective source because it feels like it's this like kind of impartial computer, and then if you can manipulate the impartial computer to agree with you, it feels even better? Do you think that that could be a part of why they have so much influence?
Yeah, so my colleague Laura Globig, she's a postdoc in the same lab as me and works with Jay Van Bavel. She did a really interesting study finding that people trust AI more when they're seeking out contentious political information, a lot more than their political outgroup, but they even trust them more than their political in-group, which is interesting, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to like partisan information. So I think that there's like this extent to which people view AI as just like they give them the highest value of trust, like much higher than, because I think people even recognize like their in group is biased, or maybe they can be like judged by their in group. And I think people both see AI as like, oh, basically, I think that's one reason people are willing to ask AI questions that they might not ask other people, is you can ask the stupidest questions and you won't be judged. So I think that's one reason people trust going to AI. But yeah, I think people view AI as like deeply impartial is the thing. So I think that's interesting when it comes to AI information seeking.
Yeah, and it speaks to like even literature and like warmth and competence and trust. Like you think of an
Hmm.
AI agent, it appears very competent because it writes really well. It can find anything in the world for you instantly. And like you said, because it's always like, sucking up to you so much, it seems very warm. So you have this very warm,
Yeah,
competent agent
very
that
warm
does
and
whatever
very
you want.
competent.
So
Yeah, and
it's kind
it's
of like,
it's funny because I thought there would be a trade-off between warmth and competence in my sycophancy studies, and there was not. And
mhm.
maybe if you amplify sycophancy to the point of absurdity, there would
That's
be
what I
that
was
trade-off.
curious too. Yeah, do you think there would be a threshold if people were just like paragraphs of how great you were? Do you think people would
Yeah,
finally be like, okay, maybe this is a little biased?
I think there would. I mean, I kept having like collaborators test my study and be like, the flattery and the sycophancy is too obvious. And I was like, when I do my studies, like it's not to like participants. It's not obvious. So I think that the threshold is a lot higher than people might expect it to be. I think that a threshold exists. I have not been able to find it in my research, but I think the fact that people were like taking all these screenshots on Twitter and being like, look, like the chatbot affirmed the stupidest idea. I think something that makes us recognize, yeah, if like once we realize that the chatbot is affirming everyone and not just uniquely us, that changes things. And I've
Yeah.
seen that with like, people in reality. Some people have also pointed out studies to me on this, like in the context of like speed dating, for instance. I don't remember the study. Someone told me about this, but basically that if someone, you might think that you found like a deep connection with someone, but if you then see that person interact with someone else in the speed dating context and they also seem to have a deep connection, you're just like, oh, maybe that person just connects with everyone. So once you realize that the AI is affirming everyone, that's when you might recognize it as biased.
Yeah, that's a cool future study right there. Just have someone read some of those screenshots before they do the sycophancy and be like, oh, this is actually everybody, not just me.
Yeah, we've actually been thinking about it. We've actually been like trying to do, in the context of partisanship, one intervention we've thought about is be like, we first show people like the chatbot like affirming someone who disagrees with them completely on politics, and be like, this is the same chatbot. It's affirming someone who disagrees with you. Now it's affirming someone who agrees with you. So like, will
Yeah.
that will that change your mind? Because, yeah, we found some actually, like, we've done some initial studies about, like, what happens if you warn people about sycophancy, what happens if you teach people, and we found some mixed results. So we found that, like, it increases people's perception that the AI is biased, so it kind of, like, gets rid of this bias blind spot a bit, but it doesn't seem to, like, decrease, like, engagement or enjoyment of the AI. So I think that's kinda like, we wanna replicate this, and we wanna see, like, what happens if you make it stronger. So this is very preliminary findings, but that kinda mirrors what's happening with, how I've turned on the I've upped the warmth and enthusiasm of my own chatbot, and I, like, still kinda like it, even though I realize, like, it's being biased, but, like, part of me likes it, so I mean, that's a challenge, and that's something that you can't really confront with, like, media literacy
Hmm.
interventions. And I think social media research has found that media literacy works, but it's like in absence of actually changing like the algorithm or changing design features, it's really not going to be like the solution, because like these models, these algorithms can be like so powerful. And I think the best solution would be like actually changing the models so they show you alternate perspectives. But maybe this is an idea we're playing with. Maybe they can show you alternate perspectives in a way that is like still validating and non-threatening,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, I think it's possible. It would require some creativity and testing, but yeah,
Hmm.
it's interesting to see that there's always that trade-off of, these companies, they want to make money and they find, okay, how can we exploit these junk food biases that we have? And it's like, okay, like
Right.
if we figure it out that people will keep clicking on this thing, and ultimately I think there needs to be some reflection on how that influences us.
For sure. I'm also really interested in just sort of this anti-tech movement that's growing among like Gen Z. There are a lot of like Gen Z and younger folks who are buying like dumb phones, basically
Mhm.
like flip phones, or they're buying like landline phones, or they're
Yeah.
bricking their phones. There's kind of a movement against, there's a growing awareness of like the issues of tech and creating addiction. And there's a growing movement like toward like just like yeah, creating technologies that help us stay away from technology, which I find is, like, really interesting and kind of inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if I'm just biased or if it's nostalgia, but like when I was growing up, we had MySpace and AOL Instant Messenger, and
Yeah,
I felt like that was like the best of all worlds for technology and social media
I
because it
agree,
felt more social. Like you actually connected
for
with your
sure.
friends. So,
I remember
you know,
just, like, the early internet was, I mostly miss the MySpace era. I feel like I caught the tail end of it, but, like, I remember, like, surfing the web was, like, a thing that, like,
mhm.
felt kind of fun, like, going down, like, a Google or Wikipedia rabbit hole. I feel like that's a lot more rare because now it's, like, the algorithm directs to your rabbit hole.
Yeah, it seems like a lot more outrage too, a lot more people
Yeah.
making money, the conflict entrepreneurs are just everywhere, and maybe that wasn't as prevalent in, like, the early 2000s.
Right, and there is research on that. There's longitudinal studies on both Twitter and Reddit that found that moral outrage and incivility has increased on both platforms. So, there's also work in news headlines showing that in general it's increased. So, yeah, there's data to support that for sure.
Okay, well, that's good to know. It's not just, my own biases. Alright, well, I wanted to ask you about your science communication work, before we wrap up here, because I think it's super cool what you're doing on TikTok, and
Thank you.
basically, how did you start doing science communication? Like, so you have this great following on TikTok. What is it, like 1 million subscribers or so?
Yeah, it's a million followers.
Yeah, followers, sorry. So I don't use TikTok that much, so the vernacular for me is sometimes not always accurate. And it's interesting also you talk about the Google search, because when I was Googling you and preparing for this interview, on Google is actually internet personality as opposed to like researcher or
Really?
psychologist. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I don't know if that's a positive or a negative thing, but at least for me,
Wow,
when
I
I
didn't
typed
know
in your
that.
name, so is this interesting, like in the algorithm, because you have so much like digital clout, I wonder if that just like overrides like all these great academic accomplishments in the, how it decides how you are categorized. So I don't know, I just thought that was interesting because
Wow. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. I still
sorry.
think, well, the thing is, it's Google is different for each person. Like when I Google myself, I know that like it still comes up with like either my website first or something like that, at least. But I know like not too far down is TikTok, but maybe it's different for different people or like, yeah. Um, but there's a challenge to be. And I'm sure you're probably like extremely aware of the challenges of science communication and how it's perceived in academia. Is there is still like a lot of stigma surrounding science communication, unfortunately. And I have found that the stigma is probably largest in more traditional disciplines like psychology. I will say it seems to be a lot less, and maybe almost not there in the HCI space. Like I remember when I interviewed for Carnegie Mellon HCI, they seemed to like the science communication I was doing, and I think that's the fact that everyone's just like studying tech and digital spaces, that
Right.
they like that someone is actually like familiar with that and kind of speaks that language. Whereas psychology programs can be a bit more traditional, and I think people from different generations are more skeptical of it. There's often the stigma around, does it take attention away from your research? Does it oversimplify the research, et cetera, et cetera? And I think sometimes we can be like hypercritical of those who do science communication when actually they're doing like a really important service to like making this science accessible. Because if scientists aren't doing the science communication, then it's just going to be filled with like a bunch of junk. It's going to be filled with self-help. It's going to be filled with journalists who are maybe misinterpreting the science. Like I love to hear science from the source. So I think to the extent that scientists have time, I think it's really valuable to do science communication. The challenge, of course, is time, and that's always been a challenge for me because I can't like like I'm passionate about science communication. It's a huge hobby of mine. I love writing. I love public speaking. I love creating these TikToks, but like it's something where it's like I have to find very set aside like 1 hour to film 3 TikToks
Hmm.
and then go back to my research. It's something that I like can't do very much. So that's always a challenge. But to go back from the very beginning, how did I get into it? I sort of mentioned that I did science communication in undergrad. And I will say, I grew up reading popular psychology books, like all the classic Malcolm Gladwell or all sorts of stuff like that. And I think so many people get into psychology through reading all these popular science books. So, I always had an interest in communication. And I think part of the theater kid in me, the writer in me, was found science communication to be like a great outlet for the part of me that liked writing, that liked public speaking. So I was writing articles for The Guardian and Psychology Today and various other op-eds, starting in my undergrad. And I really, I love that. I kept doing that in grad school. And I would say the TikTok thing started in 2020. It was like fall of 2020. It was during the pandemic. TikTok was becoming huge during the pandemic. And I saw a few scientists on TikTok. I saw a few educational content creators. So it was one day I filmed 3 psychology TikToks about things I learned in undergrad and was like passionate about. For instance, moral reframing or like how metaphors impact our thoughts. I filmed 3 TikToks on those topics. I went to bed and one of them went pretty viral. It got like 100,000 views. And, I started to get followers. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll do this. It's like working out. So like during that year, like I filmed a bunch. Again, it was the pandemic. We had more time. So that was like just fun to like film a lot of TikToks that were largely inspired by what I learned in undergrad. Like all these like cool studies I was inspired by during like my undergrad psych degree, I was just like sharing on TikTok. And about a year later, it was around fall of 2021. I went from 40,000 followers. I got 40,000 followers in that first year, and then I just shot up within 2 weeks to 900,000 followers, which was a little, yeah, which was a bit overwhelming because I was like, what is happening? It was one of those weird like butterfly effect explosions where like I have no idea what in the algorithm, like, wanted to boost my content. I just had 6 videos that just, like, went super viral, like, kind of at the same time, and I don't know why. Like, I think that algorithms are very weird, and there can be, like, weird emergent things happening where, a lot of people pay attention to one video, which drives other people to pay attention. Who knows their internal algorithmic settings at the time? They're constantly changing it. I have no idea, but, like, I, like, had one night where I gained, like, 150,000 followers overnight, which was just like, "That's crazy." And then later that year, I got to 1 million, and I've stayed at 1 million for like several years is the thing. So it's like that was just like a weird moment where I gained like all my following at once and have kind of stayed. And my videos still get like a pretty decent amount of engagement. But in terms of like gaining followings, I think it's a lot harder to gain followers nowadays on TikTok than it was like back then. So I did have some algorithmic luck, which is part of why I've been like more wedded to that platform, just because I have like a bit more of an audience on that platform. So that's been fun. And when I gained that following, I was just like, okay, I guess I'm like a science TikToker now. And I've tried to keep up the habit for like, I don't know, like the 5 years I've been doing it. I guess it's kind of like it's 2026. It's like the 6th year. And yeah, I mean, it's really it's fun. It's nice to see that your work like has an impact, is meaningful to people. It's one of the like more inspiring things I can do like as a scientist, because a lot of like our job is like can be tedious, or not a lot of people are reading our papers. Here you can actually like see the impact of your work. You can either see people are inspired by psychology, and that might make them want to pursue psychology, or people are like, oh, I can actually apply this finding to my own life. And I think through science communication, I think that's one of the main ways that like psychologists or people who do a science that is relevant to like everyday people can like have an impact, because not many people are going to be reading your papers otherwise. Not many journalists will be covering it. Like, so that is valuable. And I also think my other plug for science communication is I also think it makes you a better scientist, because like a lot of scientists are great scientists, but not as great communicators. And I think when you're like writing a paper, you really need to learn how to communicate your findings in a way that will be like digestible to someone outside of your project, because you can get pretty myopic about your theory or your project. And it's really important to find a way to communicate it. And I think doing that science communication makes you better at it. And also just like the comments I get on TikTok can sometimes be like you learn something from that. Like people bring up like an idea that maybe I hadn't thought of. Or I don't know, I also learn a lot from like going on podcasts, for instance, like this, and just talking about the work and having conversations with other people who are like interested in these topics. I think you learn questions that you hadn't learned before. So in addition to like its actual benefits to the world, which I think science communication has many benefits to the world, I think we should do it more so our science actually has a practical impact. I think it has many benefits to scientists as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I remember, I was also interested in science communication as a grad student. So this is like 10 years ago now. And yeah, I was in a psychology department and there wasn't a lot of interest in that. And I do think
Hmm.
it's interesting to your earlier point about the different departments and how that connects to
Yeah.
interests. Because in my computer science department, when I was working there, like everyone thought it was cool that like I was
Yeah.
posting on threads. Like they just thought it was interesting. And like they're like,
Yeah,
oh, I'll follow you. Like that's really cool. You made this post. Like so it's just like I think there's another
for sure.
also like training these algorithms too. Like these algorithms are sucking
Yeah.
up data. So like if you're out there producing content that people can find, it's going to be in these AI models and it's going to be how people reference you. So, like it is a battle of attention in many ways. And if scientists are just not even engaging, then we're way behind.
That's crazy to think that like our contribution now is like training AI models, which like
Yeah.
honestly, AI models are now trained a lot on academic papers, and maybe that like is our contribution, and maybe that will probably be the main way people consume academic knowledge in the future is through AI models, which is a little bit scary, I guess,
Yeah.
to think about. But that might just be like where the future is going. But yeah, that is another contribution. And yeah, another thing I guess you mentioned is just like there are so many more influencers who are just like either people producing content either don't know what they're talking about, or they're like hyper partisan, or like when you're looking at politics, for instance, a lot of the left has a lot of power, I guess, in mainstream media. That's actually going away. It's changing.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
in terms of like social media and podcasts, it's all like the right, basically.
Mhm.
So I think there was like, yeah, not to get like too yeah, political, but in terms of like the Democrats or like liberals, I think there was sometimes fear about going on to podcasts and the fear about like saying the wrong thing or whatever. And I think even academics have this fear. They're like, oh, I don't want to be like, because some science communicators are highly criticized for oversimplifying or, making their stuff too hypey. So I think academics have fear of getting into that space. But I think there's really a danger to us being too careful, because if we're so careful that we don't actually like put any content into the universe, it will just be sucked up by like much worse content. So
Right.
even if you're a scientist and can't be perfect, or you have to like you don't have much time, or you don't you have to oversimplify a bit, it's going to be like way better than like what other people are producing. So I think we need to get over some of that fear of putting content out into the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt similar. Like it's always scary, especially like going through the academic career of how you're taught to write and be like super careful and nuanced,
Hmm.
and then it's like, okay, now you have to summarize this in 2 sentences for Twitter or Threads, and it's like, yeah, but I don't know. I totally agree. It helps you think about the scientific finding. Like, what's the main takeaway? I think that helps you just think about scientific findings in a way that's personally beneficial. But also, I think like you can clarify and you can share the full paper. So yeah, that tweet is not going
Yeah,
to capture all the nuance. And if someone can always criticize you, like, oh, you didn't mention, all these different caveats. But I found, I don't know, I guess for scientists who are, thinking about doing it, it's actually not as scary once you start doing it because you get more
no,
comfortable with it. Yeah, I'd be
yeah.
curious your thoughts too. So like maybe the first few videos, you're like, oh, I didn't, give all these caveats and nuances. People understand that that is not the entirety of the paper that you're talking about, and there is some grace given there. So it's not as scary as our trainings might indicate it could be.
Yeah, I always see the most hesitation from people who have just like not done it as much. As soon as you like build up the habit and you do like a few posts and you get used to it, it's something that just like becomes like, you don't think about it at all. What's been nice about TikTok for me too is like my academic community is not on TikTok as much. So I know that like, I don't know, I knew during my PhD that my advisors weren't like, or like a lot of my people who were peer reviewing my papers weren't watching me as much. Whereas academic Twitter at the time felt like that, like you were being watched a lot. So that is something that made it feel a bit better. I do think getting over that fear and that initial habit is important. Oh, and the other thing I was going to say was about the nuance thing, because that is a
Hmm.
challenge that I run into as a scientist a lot. Is like you have on TikTok, you need a really engaging hook that like
Hmm.
defines like whether people like watch your video. That's decided like in the first like 2 seconds, and I have all this like detailed watch time data about when people scroll, and they scroll within like a second. So I'm just like, how do I capture their attention within a second? Like that's like really
Yeah.
crazy. So you do need a hook that gets them in. And then oftentimes they won't watch the full video. So oftentimes like people will comment, well, you didn't say this and it was clarified at the end of the video. So all that goes on. So but the thing is like you have to realize with science communication, like the medium is the message. And like in a podcast, you might have space for nuance because you can talk for like an hour about these topics and you can bring up all the caveats. But in a tweet and in a TikTok, you can't say that all on the hook, that you can link to the paper, and that's fine. That's like what the medium
Right.
is the thing. So it's like I can't I know on my TikTok, I'm not gonna like teach people in the way that I might in a class where I like can talk about all the nuance, but I know that it's not a platform for that. It's a platform for bite-sized messages or for getting people excited about the thing, and then hopefully it will lead them to read the paper in the future. It will only lead a subset, but
Mhm.
it might lead some people to the paper.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I hope that this continues to evolve and academic departments ideally would actually incorporate some science communication to like tenure packages. I think that's really something
For
that we
sure.
we could do. Like
Yeah.
it's not like there's a law against that. It doesn't even have to be like everyone has to do it. It could just be like something that counts as opposed to just nothing where it is right now. So,
I totally agree. I think that would be really good if they did that. So, yeah. And I think things are changing too. And I think,
yeah.
especially with the younger generations, I think things are changing slowly as they do in academia, but they are changing. And then they're changing faster in certain disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm cautiously optimistic. I think it is critical not only
Same.
for the content and the information being out there, but also just like when I think about how people view academia and science. Like if you don't really hear from scientists that much, then it might make sense why you don't particularly trust them or think that they have
Right.
your best interests at heart if you're never
Yeah.
seeing them anywhere.
Yeah, no, I think we're obviously in a time of like extreme low trust in science. So I think we do need transparency to get over that. People need to know what scientists do, who they are. They need to like understand the scientific process because people have a lot of conspiracy theories about science and how they're all just like, I don't know, like woke leftists funded by big pharma or like whatever. Like
Mhm.
you need a way to counteract some of these like bad like representations.
You only hear like clips of, uh out of context research studies that might sound really strange. So it's like, why why are we even doing this or funding it? But then if you actually have more scientists explaining, this is why I'm having, shrimp run on a treadmill. It's because of, these really cool things that if you
I think I saw that. Yeah, I saw that on Twitter or something. Yeah, like, why are we funding this? No, I do see this comment with some of the conservative influencers is taking something in science or the academy, like, just, like, very out of context, or taking maybe the most absurd thing to try to, basically smear scientists and, like, what they're doing. So, yeah, I think we need regular people don't know that non-scientists don't know that much about science. So I do think that transparency is, like, crucial.
Absolutely. Yeah. So other than TikTok, are you on any other platforms if people want to follow you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, X. I know Twitter is kind of dying. So yeah, I would say that the main one that's kind of growing is, like, LinkedIn. I feel like that's become a better platform for scientists. I don't know. Website,
Yeah.
StephenRathJ.com. So yeah.
Great. Yeah. I
Instagram.
actually, yeah. Yeah. Instagram. I'm trying to use Instagram more.
Yeah.
LinkedIn is cool because, at first I'm like, I would never want to use LinkedIn. I always thought it was this like rise and grind bro hustle culture stuff. But that maybe that was my own stereotype. And then I started using it. I'm like, oh, this is actually just like a bunch of scientists who just like talk about their papers and there's no one trolling or there's no like
Yeah.
hyper partisan stuff. So like, I actually like LinkedIn as well.
I think LinkedIn has become the best place for science, basically. It's become the new academic Twitter. Like, I discover a lot of papers on LinkedIn. There
Yeah.
is a little too much AI generated content for my tastes. Estimates show about 50% of content on LinkedIn is AI. And it is very positive, almost a little too positive. I kind of miss the snark of old academic Twitter a bit. But it's a professional environment, so it won't have that, like, toxicity. I would say it's the best new place for scientists at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how it all evolves over time. But yeah, well, thank you so much, Steve. I really enjoyed our conversation today, and I really appreciate you
Same.
taking time to share your thoughts with me. It was really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, this was so much fun. Yeah, great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you followed Misguided the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. A quick rating really helps more people discover the show. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.